an annual payment structure. And again, this isn't a tax agreement. HCAs have nothing to do with pilots, taxes, or otherwise. They're in some cases voluntary, in other cases a mandatory payment enforced through either site plan or through a town permitting mechanism. Oftentimes they're buried in a decommissioning agreement. There's an upfront payment made to absorb municipal impacts for water, fire, sewer, whatever, and or decommissioning bonds. There's those decommissioning bonds that are on every project are in fact a payment made to the town in the form of a bond or a protective escrow agreement. In this particular case, or when the IDA is considering its uniform policy with respect to pilots, you've set up now a platform that provides a fixed dollar amount per megawatt AC with an escalator, in your case reversing payments, to apply to all pilots associated with renewable energy projects. That's a uniform approach. That's the intent of the UTEP. In the case where a town, in any particular instance, requires an HCA that is just an upfront one-shot, it's really no different than a building permit. You know, the towns collect hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes on a building permit, depending on the cost of the project. And that's outside our purview. We've never seen that stuff. If they happen to want to collect also an upfront HCA payment, that doesn't destabilize, impact, or otherwise interfere with the pilot. It's just upfront payment. It's like your pilot fee. The pilot fee that you collect at 2%, it doesn't interfere with or impact any distributions to the taxing jurisdictions. It's the HCAs that have recurring revenues annually that you really want to take into account. For example, if you're using a $5,500 per megawatt pilot plus land taxes, and the town is looking for $3,000 a year, escalating or not, it's obviously going to have an impact on the discussion. Because if the developer is saying, well, geez, with the pilot, which is $5,500, and now the town hitting me at $8,500 or $3,000 on top, and an $8,500 annual going in rate, it's going to impact your discussion and how ultimately the combined distribution is measured out. In that particular instance, if the pilot were to be closed alone, as you mentioned, the town might get 10% of that $5,500 per megawatt, so $550. With this HCA structure that I just used as an example and an analogy, the town's going to end up something like more $3,500, and then the rest of the taxing jurisdictions would get distribution pro rata on the balance of the pilot. So it's just something to take into account, and most often and typically best deployed, like you said, you really want all the taxing jurisdictions kind of at the table with the IDA aligned with the developer as a form of a conversation and a platform, not necessarily the developer going to the town, then going to the school, going to the county, and then going to you and creating a bit of chaos. So the clause in the UTEP is included pretty much in all of the clients I've been assisting on this matter for several years. It gives you the right to step back and say, okay, because the town is charging more in a particular instance, and we tend to put aside the upfront payments because it doesn't affect the long-term pilot. But if there is a year-over-year HCA payment involved, it's going to change the dynamic of your discussion. And the developer is going to say, I'm going to not do this project if the town's getting me and the IDA is at a certain level. So you may end up with a pilot that goes in at 4,000 per megawatt, and the HCA is going to say what it's going to say. All this language does in the UTEP is provides you with discretion to look at the big picture and say, is everybody kind of coming out fair here? And it's an important clause to keep. I think at least one of the towns, their council, provided some comments with some concerns about the statement, but at the end of the day, it protects the town as well, because you're not locked into offering a pilot at 5,500. You have discretion, and you're also protecting yourself to say, I don't really like how this looks in the big picture, so we're not going to accept the application, which I think we've had an example like that in the not too distant past. So it gives you the ability to pause if you'd like to, or adjust how you're going into the pilot to reflect the big picture. That's kind of my 2 cents, and perhaps that provides a little bit of context on why that clause is included in the proposed UTEP.
And it is common, that is common language in IDAs across the state.
With that could be a policy that says this is it. And if you have a concern about an HCA or how an HCA may be impacting your pilot discussion, you have the right to point to the UTEP and say, hey, listen, we need to take into account these things as a matter of policy, and we're going to adjust our pilot if we think it's appropriate, or perhaps not even consider one because we think there's an imbalance, or the parties haven't really gotten together, parties being your affected taxing jurisdictions that you have a bit of a fiduciary duty to protect, just as the board member mentioned. But also, you have discretion. Without that clause, you're kind of locked in. So taking into consideration HCAs gives you the flexibility you ultimately want to either take a pass or adjust things in a way that in the big picture makes sense. It's totally fine for towns to come in and require these kind of payments. Sometimes they'll do it in a fashion that kind of has you scratching your head, whether it's born out of the site plan that might look like an extraction, or if it's a town board in the context of a building permit or a variance or zoning consideration. Better done, it's really at the town board level in the big picture at the building permit level, as opposed to having it buried in a site plan or a planning commission or board level. Those get a little weird. At all events, the IDA is going to reserve its rights to listen, see how the conversation is going with developer and taxing jurisdictions, and make adjustments as necessary. Ideally, in a perfect world, there never is one, but the IDA is the one-stop shop that's going to be doing these pilots. If there are HCAs out in the community, they're going to have diverse expectations. Not every town is the same. This clause in the UTEP allows you to be flexible and tap out or hit pause if things look imbalanced, or to the extent that things look fairly balanced, you have the ability to be flexible and adjust your pilot in a way that kind of balances trade. What I would try to avoid or kind of shy away from are instances where, and that's why I stepped in a little bit, where you say, well, we're going to go out to the taxing jurisdictions and get their consents for distribution. I wouldn't subject yourself to that spanking machine, if you will, or that process where you're going out and treating it like the old days, like everything's a deviation and expecting an approval before you can move ahead. I would instead try to rely on your flexible policy without having to ask for permission in any particular event. You just have the discretion to tailor your pilots and moving forward on any particular pilot only when you're comfortable in doing so.
Justin, I have a quick question of you, but first, we should probably introduce Justin. Justin is with Harris Beach, a law firm we go to on retainer a lot for some of these issues. They work out of Albany. They work with a lot of IDAs around the rest of the state. They're our go-to law firm. He has a lot of experience dealing with taxation and UTEPs all across New York State in conjunction with New York State government. So it keeps us on a higher playing field with knowledge. My question to you, Justin, is with what you just said, do you feel confident addressing a letter to Justin Burrows, answering his concerns?
Absolutely. If the board wants to reply either through adoption of the policy, and we're in minutes right now, this is a public response. The UTEP is tailored in such a fashion that the IDA is retaining discretion in all events, and also taking into account and deferring to local home rule. In any event, an HCA, a host community agreement, is a municipality speaking through policy. We're going to respect that. The statement that will take into account the use or existence of any HCA is as much of a reservation of discretion on your part as it is respecting their local home rule preferences. We're just going to try to adapt our pilots and go in and facilitate economic development and renewable energy projects as best we can. But we have the ability to right size or take into account those factors, which primarily are financial. If a town's coming in and demanding $10,000 a megawatt, puts you in a really tough spot. So you can hit pause and say, well, geez, let's look at the big picture. And if town, it makes sense to, instead of asking for $10,000 a year or $10,000 per megawatt per year over 15 years, would it make more sense to have an upfront HCA that doesn't necessarily impact pilot discussion that we're having as a collection of taxing jurisdictions and IDA? There's ways to get there, and typically that's best done through really close coordination with Dave and staff and representatives of the taxing jurisdictions, shoulder to shoulder, talking about that project, and then collectively engaging with the developer. And I'm not doing this in a necessarily negative way, but you've all seen how the 487 conversations can go and how it's completely chaotic. There's even oddball donation agreements going on. I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. I don't understand it. But what it does is it puts the IDA in a real hamstrung position as a facilitator to help these projects when you have these chaotic conversations going on. The best way to really organize is to deploy uniform economic development by the IDA and having a partnership with your taxing jurisdictions is to really link up the taxing jurisdictions and the IDA to face the developers and work with them in a collaborative way to come to the best result. So if I were to respond or help with the communication with that representative who contacted you on behalf of the taxing jurisdiction, the overarching response and theme is this is put in there to help them too. And we want to be a partner with them, end up with the best looking HCA that fits their local home rule.
I think,
Did it even require a response? It's an opinion, really.
yeah, but I think that, I mean, this letter came, attention, Dave, I think it either should come from him or myself or him and I, and Justin can help tweak it.
Right, I think it should be addressed because we are gonna hear this argument. The solar projects are coming out of the gate with host community agreements. And it's gonna be an issue on the table, and it's before us, you know, the misunderstanding somewhat of our role and how we play it. We need to clarify it.
No,
Yeah, and I think too, and maybe the letter back to the boroughs comes from you as chair, but I think we can also send a letter to the tax jurisdiction explaining this is not saying no, but it's saying we consider it one way or the other, positive or negative. So.
Yeah, that's right. But what Justin just said, it has to be done cooperatively, and that's the problem we had with the one situation where it was done unilaterally. And that's where the problem arises. If there's gonna be an HCA, I think it's important that everyone sees what's on the table before we commit to it.
And Justin, oh, sorry.
And I have one last question. Another comment was raised, a question was raised by a a county legislator today about protecting for road damage. We have a project agreement that follows the pilot, correct?
We can't have.
Can we put road damage indemnification into a project agreement following a pilot approval?
Generally, those matter, and again, those matters are most typically born out of site plan approvals, local planning board, town board. Sometimes there isn't a local planning board, and sometimes there isn't a local town code that deals with these things. And in those instances, these projects and the developers sometimes can just go to the town building inspector, pull a permit. It's really remarkable in some really rural locations where there's no site plan controls, but where there are some, a planning board or a town board that controls through code provisions, those impact considerations are generally spoken to and through the site plan approval, where they have berming, vegetation, screening, and how the site is going to sit, whether it's going to be avoiding wetlands, how they may deal with roadway impacts, and quite frankly, an upfront HCA payment, that's one of the bases for it. Are they going to rack the road? If so, they're going to make a compensation payment to the town for any kind of reconstruction or addressing any impacts that the project may bear. That's really the basis for this thing.
Justin, a lot of towns do or don't have agreements with, say, the state or the county to maintain roads, because a number of these projects are on county or state roads, but they're in town purview with regards to site plan. So like, I know the town I live in, we don't have the ability to maintain the state road. We gotta have an agreement with New York State. And we actually approved a project on New York State Route 178. So I don't think the town I live in addressed if the road got damaged or not, but that would be a state concern. So there are, I think to your point, there's a lot of gray areas with regards to who's got the ball. And that's where the county probably.
And the real problem comes with everyone fast tracking seeker on these projects and not taking a hard look at all these. So you get a negative declaration on the impacts, and then you try to negotiate payments to mitigate impacts that you haven't addressed in the environmental review. So, but I think you clarified a lot for everybody that this isn't a yes or, if you do an HCA, it's a no. It's that it gives latitude both ways on projects.
Mr. Chairman, since we had a couple guests that we discussed this, would it be out of place to see if they have additional questions, or was this clarified? Is that okay to ask that?
My question would be the negotiation between, for the pilot program, having everybody involved, the applicants for the wind energy. The letter that you sent here was that it addresses renewable energy projects under 20 megawatt. Now, does that mean anybody above the 20 megawatt wouldn't have that negotiation yet?
Well, so our UTEP, which is our uniform tax, the idea behind the uniform tax exemption policy is to take a uniform approach to all these pilots that we're doing across the county. So anything that's outside of that is what we call deviation, which would need the approval of all the affected taxing jurisdictions. So right now, our pilot is looking at under 20 megawatts, because if they're over 20 megawatts, they have the option to going to the state, which is reviewed not by the local planning board, but by the state process. And if they're 25 or above, they're mandatory to go through the state process. So if something came to us that was over 20 megawatts, we would have to come up with, that's not within our UTEP. So that would be a deviation, at which point we would be negotiating a pilot abatement, a pilot structure. We would need the approval of each of the taxing jurisdictions to proceed with that.
Just to clarify, that would apply to any style of project, not just renewable.
Right.
So something that doesn't fit, like if somebody wanted to come to us for a hotel and we didn't normally grant proceeds for hotels, it could be considered as a deviation. So the 20 megawatt threshold was what we decided that was 20 megawatt and less, or the style of projects that seem to be populating the county. And it aligned more with state regulations,
Right,
where different approval agencies would or might not involve town. Because this 94C that your town of Worth may be familiar with is 20 megawatt or less. Above 20 megawatt, the state may have an approval process. So it affects everything, including renewable. So we wanted to clarify, this isn't just about renewable energy. If somebody wants to build a hotel, we don't normally grant those proceeds. Come to us with a deviation. It may be a very good reason we would want to grant a pilot.
So if we're doing, if you read the earlier passage on the manufacturing project, so we typically will provide a 15-year pilot that would give the manufacturers, a new manufacturing facility, a 50% discount averaged out over that 15-year period. We might change the payment schedule within that period, percentages, whatever, it would still be equivalent to 50% over 15 years. If we have a large project coming in with much more benefit to the county and the region, we may go beyond 15 years for the pilot. But in that case, it would be a deviation. So we would have to get, again, the taxing jurisdiction approval because we're doing it outside our normal.
So realistically, Dave, it's just one extra step?
Yes.
Is that the simple way of saying it?
But the concerning trend, though, coming to your question of the 20 megawatts, it appears from things we're seeing from the state, anything over 20 megawatts, they may be taking all the local input right out of the equation.
it wouldn't go in front of the town planning board over 20 megawatts if they choose to use the state approval process. Like the project that's been proposed in Rutland, the top of the hill, that project doesn't go through local zoning. That project be approved by the state.
And they're now indicating that they probably gonna negotiate the pilot at that, outside of our jurisdiction.
It just may not involve
Well,
our
they
agency.
don't have, they aren't gonna negotiate the pilot. They can establish an HC.
Right.
But not the pilot. And the question becomes, and Justin gone?
No, he's there.
He's still there.
Have you heard anything on the state's efforts to establish the uniform appraisal methodology yet? Is there anything coming back?
I haven't seen any updates. I know they're, in typical fashion, supposed to form a committee who's gonna make recommendations to be considered and then deployed, so.
So that could affect our discussions, you know, depending on what they do, maybe we're out of the business and maybe they're just gonna pay full taxation.
There's a couple of things there to keep an eye on. Number one, it could be 12 to 18 months before those things actually become defined and then put into effect, which would then go into effect as of the next relevant tax status dates for appraiser or assessors to pay attention to or adhere to. So if we're seeing this in 2023, I'd be shocked. That being said, the most likely impact, this is the way it was drafted, is that the assessment of these assets is going to be significantly reduced or curtailed. I don't know what the word is, but they're going to be valued at a discounted cash basis, not on a cost or sale or capital expense basis. There's been a range of $500,000 a megawatt on the low end to $1 million, $1.5 million, and even I've seen some projects get hit at $2 million a megawatt, which is way out of range. The net effect of this on a discounted cash basis is going to result in a number of things. I'm going to presume that the smaller community-based solar under a megawatt may not even want to go for a 487 pilot or an IDA pilot. What's the use? What's the value there? Given the chaos, especially with 487 pilots. So the lower end of projects may not be a throughput or pipeline projects that you're going to see anymore, which is probably okay. The 3, 5, and 10s are certainly going to want the continued predictability. There may be some pressure put on the $5,500 mark at some point once we get a sense of how the industry absorbs the new assessments. So there's going to be some continuing policy hits that we're going to see in the next 18 to 24 months as we look at this thing. There's also, and importantly, potentially going to be an impact on pilots that were put in place. You may have some developers that come back and say, I want to change it and pay less, in which case you say, geez, a deal's a deal. You may see some smaller pilots that were closed in the early days, just the developer saying, if I pay full taxes, it's going to be about the same thing, so I don't want to terminate. Which in your case would be like, geez, that's great, it's one last project to report on Paris, so here's your termination docs. And that by extension is going to displace or to a certain extent impact host community agreements that have already been deployed on a per megawatt basis. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of deals that get terminated and some weird discussions with towns, between developers and towns on those HCAs if they want to back away from those obligations. So it's going to be positive in ways and disruptive in others. I guess we're kind of laying back and waiting to see how the committee turns out the regs and how that assessment standard is put in place.
We just saw an appraisal for a proposed project that kind of blows my mind. It's even higher than the last one we had. It more than justifies where we are. So,
An appraisal or an assessment came out of a...
an appraisal that was submitted as part of an.
There's another solar project. I can't remember the name of the company. It was a newer one. I may have sent to you, Justin.
And it was done on a discounted cash flow basis, but.
They have not submitted an application yet. They were just sending us their appraisal, knowing what our policy was, trying to justify saying we would like to, ask for a lower megawatt fee. but the appraisal they sent us did not support.
Just
charging.
undermine their position completely.
That's funny.
We can afford 6,000.
So it all depends how the state establishes, but they were using a power purchase agreement type scenario. And my concern on these large ones is that if they pick the zone wholesale price, it's gonna plummet the value estimations. So if you go from 9 cents a kilowatt hour in the PPA scenario to 2.5 cents in a utility scale, it's gonna have it, and it may not even be worth considering a pilot at that time.
Other questions,
Yeah.
guys?
It kind of starts and stops with the assessor, whatever they hang on the project, and that's what's remaining. That's kind of the piece.
Did we further confuse you, or you got more
Yeah.
questions?
I just want to close with this. I realize possibly you won't take out that section under your draft, property, real property tax abatement pay, number, under number 20, number 2B. I take it that's going to remain in the draft. If you wouldn't, if you would consider tabling this for further answer from Mr. Burrows or any other people that might want to have comments on this issue.
I don't see any reason to table at this point. We've had, letters around all the tax jurisdictions. We've had public hearing, plenty of opportunity for comment. I think we'll address Mr. Burrow's letter,
Okay.
explain that the way he's interpreting this is not the way that it's meant. That, as Mr. Miller explained, it protects the towns as well as, the IDA's interest. And it's not saying yes or no, it's saying we take into account. Protect everyone's interest.
If Town of Worth has a project and you want a host community agreement, what we described to you, just come to us as a deviation. You can still come to the IDA, but it's under a deviation that has more scrutiny. That's all this is. You don't get the standard treatment, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but we don't have to go out to the school and the town and the county but you can come for a project, well, not you, but the applicant. So you have another mechanism. It's not taking it away. It's just saying we have to treat it a little differently. Because like if in a normal project, Town of Worth gets 15% of the tax and the county gets 35 and the school gets the rest, as our attorney explained, if all of a sudden you get 50% and the school gets 30 and the county gets 10, guess what? Your partners are a little maybe upset.
Right.
That's all this is trying to prevent.
Okay.
It's probably the easiest way we can describe it.
We don't want to get in a
That's
situation.
fair. A lot of school kids sitting on these solar panels.
Yeah. Now, if we were playing poker, I just want to take the chip in front of you. You'd let me do that, right? For
The
free.
towns get in front of these things generally. I mean, there's outliers. Say there could be a state road or something like that, but generally the towns sit on these things and have to babysit them and make sure that, they're not gonna go out and buy built fire trucks or anything like that, but the town generally has the measurable impacts to identify for public safety and decommissioning concerns. So in the big picture, if your pilot's showing $5,500 and the town is showing, $2,500 in their HCA and there's 8,000 on the table, and the town happens to be getting out of that picture, 3,000 or 4,000 of it, I personally don't see an issue. The 500 is going out pro rata, because that's what the IDA law says. The town is getting its portion of the pilot, which is de minimis, but they have the impacts. The school's getting what in the normal course is probably a disparate portion of the pilot because of their tax base and their bill rate. But again, they're not providing any services and having any costs associated with these things, so it's kind of found money. And those are the big, way 50,000 foot discussions that kind of guide these things throughout the state, that kind of help there might be some friction between the town and the school, where the school's saying, well, the town's getting more than usual. But in these particular cases, the town is bearing, a disparate amount of the impacts, and perhaps that makes sense.
And I've just said, since we do have two representatives in towns here, we are also working with the Tug Hill Commission that you're familiar with, to try to co-sponsor a workshop this fall on these renewable energy assessments, kind of better understand them and how they work and such. But also to point out to you, I have heard in the past some concerns from town board members or supervisors that, well, you're giving this big break on the taxes to the solar projects. I don't get that kind of break, but also to point out that one, these are payments that are new that you're not receiving now, so it's additional money to the town. But again, the pilot that we're providing, these tax breaks are only to the solar project itself. In many cases, they're leasing the land on which the project is. This is not an abatement on so the land underlying the lease underneath that project is not getting a tax break. And in many cases, the assessed value of that property now goes up. The assessor will look at it and say, okay, that's not vacant farmland anymore. That's generating revenue. We're going to assess that at a higher value. So the towns are still going to see increased taxation from that as well as the pilot payment, because the land value is going to go up underneath the project.
Thank you.
Okay.
Much more to discuss?
I guess, our concern in the town of Rutland is we don't feel that, with a pilot program, we would get the revenue that would take. You take like on an $8 million project, we may get $500-600 a year off that project. That's almost nothing compared to $8 million investment. That's just an example. And, like you said, the schools, they get a bigger share, and yet the town's property is, somebody's gonna drive down by there and look at a bunch of black things. You know, it's not very appealing to the average person, but yet we're taking a hit on the smaller fund, small dollar money that we're receiving. That's why I guess we're kind of opposed to the pilot program.
Would you like to see them assessed at full value?
Well, it depends on whether we take the whole program out or not, but I think that would be the solution. But on the other hand, they hate to lose it. But if these agencies are getting federal and state money to put these programs in, they're gonna go forward with them anyway, whether they get a tax break or not.
Oh, and that's partly the reason the county has taken the position that anything over 20 megawatts, the county wants to see them assessed at full value.
So why in a smaller project, under 20 megawatts, why should they get the tax breaks? The same as the higher ones.
But even at 100%, you know, your example of $550 tax, now you're gonna get $1,000, and does it still offset? You know, it is additional revenue.
Not really. That may not.
And again, the value of the land that the project sits on is going to go up in value, which is going to increase taxes as well. It's like somebody.
Well, that's all I have to say about it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. It's time.
I will reiterate though, when you evaluate all those 20 megawatts, community solar projects, and there's a couple of commercial ones coming down the road that are substantial, when you add up, we're keeping a running tally here in the agency of additional tax revenue that all taxing jurisdictions are saying. It's significant. There's significant tax dollars that county and towns and school districts are, when you add them all up, due to solar development, it's something to shake a stick at. It's significant. It's an opportunity. It's done right.
Alrighty. On the resolution, roll call vote, please.
Ron,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
Bill,
Yes.
Lisa. Yes. Ed,
Yes.
Paul.
Yes.
Resolution carries.
Thank you, Big Tony.
Thank you,
Thank you, gentlemen.
Might be tonight. It's dinner time almost.
Fill up the shiny spot here.
Go to page 99.
Yeah.
We have a resolution, but I think at this time I'd entertain a motion to go into executive session to discuss the proposed acquisition, sale, or lease of real property.
So moved.
Second.
Where
And
we keeping,
we would invite the LDC members, staff, and council. On the motion, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Carries. We're now in executive session.
Greg is in.
Yep.